So I am Arietta Papaconstantinou. I teach late antique history at the University of Reading in the UK. And I'm very, very happy to be presenting Yuliya's book, which has really broken new ground in late antique studies. Because although multilingualism is in texts and on the ground, let's say, has occupied many of us in the field, the theoretical approaches to language, and that is not the modern theoretical approaches to language, but how the late antique people understood it and wrote about it, is a subject that has remained, or that had remained until this book, largely unexplored. Yuliya holds degrees in history and medieval studies from the National University of Kiev, from the Central European University, and from the Catholic University of America, including 2 PhDs from Kiev and from the CUA, the latter being at the origin of this book. She has held fellowships and received research support from Dunbar Noakes, the Marco Institute of Medieval and Renaissance Studies at the University of Tennessee in Knoxville, the Sager Center for Hellenic Studies, and the Committee for the Study of Late Antiquity at Princeton, where she says most of the book was written, and the Notre Dame Institute for Advanced Study. She has also taught at Notre Dame and the University of Alabama, where she is currently an associate professor in classics. One of the exciting things she's done after this book, I would say, is her collaboration with Pavel Novakovsky's project on epigraphy and identity in the early Byzantine Middle East, where she co-organized, with whom she co-organized some really interesting panels at Kalamazoo and Leeds, which are, I believe, in course of publication now. Has also produced a number of really interesting articles on the subject of language and identity in late antiquity. So the slow fall of Babel, I'll mainly let you talk about it, but just to frame, explores late antique, or say early Christian, more precisely, thought, largely patristic, but not only, and in several languages. So thought on language, their thoughts on, it's largely metalinguistic, so it's not the analysis of the languages in which they write, but what they say about them. What they say about foreign languages, what they say about linguistic history, on the relative value of languages, linguistic diversity more generally. Of course, Babel is understood here, and it's a bit of an enigmatic title. It actually explains this in the introduction. It's understood as a metaphor for the classical, or at least pre-late antique paradigm of a world that is mainly, or perceived mainly, as monolingual, with kind of marginal languages on the side, and where ultimately linguistic diversity was a negative thing. Its fall, the fall of that paradigm, marks a new one, where the linguistic diversity becomes more accepted. Yuliya sees this as an effect largely of the Christian approach to language, where, let's say, the Pentecostal story sets the agenda of this renewed attitude. And her book analyzes the different ways in which the early Christian authors, often themselves steeped in classical scholarship and classical models, came to terms with this, what she calls the new distinctly Christian paradigm. Now, the negotiation of linguistic and confessional identities in the thought of these authors was to a large extent normative, or at least it tried to classify what they observed into something that was less messy than the reality that faced them. I will let Yuliya kind of elaborate more on this and present her core argument, which she will certainly be better at than myself. I just want to end by saying that everyone should pick up this book. Apart from being a really fantastic compendium of ideas about language in late antiquity, and you can work at that from from the index, it's also a brilliant piece of intellectual history on linguistic matters, with a very much sensitivity to actual really linguistic theory as well. And it will bring a lot to the field, not only of multilingualism in late antiquity, but more generally late antique thought, because it goes much further than just the linguistic issues. So I think the field has a lot to gain from this book in general. So Yuliya, I'll pass the floor to you.
Thank you, Arietta, and thank you, organizers. And it's very generous and kind words, Arietta. I will try to keep it short to leave more time for discussion, but I do see points of connections already with the previous presentation. It's so interesting, you know, all these arguments about the value of anecdotal evidence and strange stories, which are difficult to make sense on and by itself, but when you put it together and when you have kind of critical mass of those stories, there is possible to build an argument based on those evidence. And the underlying anxiety in society that sometimes postulates the importance of constructed links between different forms of identity, which may have nothing to do with, you know, real sociological reality, historical reality, but it is underlying for understanding what people feel about themselves, about their society, about, you know, their world. This is important. But to start with, I want all us to think about this question. What does it take and what does it mean to be a foreign language speaker in late antique Christianity? So was such a person considered to be a heretic, a barbarian, or a Christian of equal standing? Were multilingual skills something that would create a saint? Or let's say maybe it was a sign of a demon or demonic powers? We can imagine, you know, a person in a 4th century Constantinople, Greek-speaking, who went to church and who perhaps knew that somewhere on outskirts of his vast empire, there were some strange, presumably barbarian people who spoke all sorts of bizarre languages, but who also counted themselves Christians. So where those people, you know, where was our Constantinopolitan fellow thinking about those people as Christians of equal standing, who just happened to speak a strange language, or the fact that they spoke this strange language, prayed to God in this language, affected their standing as Christians? So the book is about Christian ideas, about linguistic history, linguistic diversity, foreign languages. It investigates how different, how language differences and language-related social cultural stereotypes were drawn in the process of constructing and negotiating distinctly Christian, but also separate confessional identities as they started to form in the context of Trinitarian and Christological controversies in late antiquity. And as Arietta generously introduced, you know, the point behind this maybe strange title of my book, The Slow Fall of Babel. So The Slow Fall of Babel is a story about transformation of the way in which increasingly Christianized elites in late antique Mediterranean experienced and conceptualized linguistic differences. The metaphor of Babel stands for this magnificent edifice of classical culture, which was about to reach the sky, but which remained self-contained and self-sufficient in its virtual monolingualism, within which even Latin was sometimes considered as a dialect of Greek. So The erosion of this vision was step-by-step process in which so many early Christian authors, intellectuals were involved, and what they needed, what was the task at front of them, was to incorporate meaningfully all those foreign languages and foreign language speakers in a holistic, specifically Christian picture of the universe. The fact that there are multiple languages in the world came up front of their thought, and this needed to be somehow meaningfully explained within the Christian frame. The very concept of foreign language that I'm working in this book is problematic and deserves further discussion. Because, of course, within the earliest centuries, Christianity reached speakers of Latin, Syriac, Gothic, Arabic dialects, Persian, Armenian, Georgian, so many other languages. And of course, they all were mutually foreign language speakers to each other. And experiences of people who were bilinguals or multilinguals, of course, endlessly complicate this question. So not all of those perspectives are adequately reflected in our primary sources. My book is Mediterranean-centered in a way, so it tries to account for the positions of Greek, Latin, Syriac, and occasionally Coptic texts, Coptic writers. And when it comes to, anxieties in society and those artificial, rhetorical, ideological links that we had such a wonderful discussion in the previous book presentation, speaking about the links between confessional and linguistic identities in late antiquity, those identities indeed overlapped in all variety of interesting ways, producing hybrid combinations and dynamic loyalties, all these sort of things. But what should be said, those links between confessional affiliations and languages were definitely not absolute. It never prevented people who wanted to use those links tendenciously from doing so. So I would say that both Orthodox and heterodox groups contributed to the process, to the building associative links between certain languages or ethnic group and confessional identities, let's say Vandals or Goths and Arianism, Syriac, speakers of Syriac and followers of non-Chalcedonian doctrines, or Punic and Donatists. And why those links between languages and religious affiliations were not fixed and absolute. This did not preclude someone from being able to postulate the importance, to emphasize the importance. As is often the case with any anti-something rhetoric. So once it's on the table, it's difficult to get rid of. It's always available, though it's not always used. Writers who mentioned language differences, accents, or dialects when they served polemical purposes of their narratives. Orthodox Greek and Latin intellectuals, they of course represented the traditions that were overall perceived as more culturally advanced, most prestigious literary traditions in the Mediterranean. Their remarks on language peculiarities in speech of their doctrinal opponents were used in order to create alienating effect in the rhetorical plane. And those remarks were not, they didn't always faithfully reflect the reality on the ground, but in fact, they didn't mean to. So they give us access, insight into this world of, as the previous presenter said, rumors and strange stories that still affected the social climate on the ground, the culture of the period. I would say. Thank you.